The storm began without sound, a vibration that whispered through the deepest layers of the Pacific rather than across its surface. The trench sensors, steel nerves spanning thousands of miles, lit up in a slow, deliberate pattern that suggested will rather than accident. Pressure spiked beyond the limits of tectonic reason. The ocean floor split in a geometric symmetry that defied nature, as though precision itself had been buried beneath miles of water, waiting for permission to rise. Commander Arya Cade stood beneath the cold light of the command deck, a woman carved from years of conflict and sleepless decisions. Around her, the Pacific Strategic Fleet hummed with readiness. Her crew's movements were clipped and efficient, the kind of choreography that came from survival rather than training. The data feeds on her console scrolled faster than comprehension, but one truth emerged through the static: the ocean was opening like a wound, and it was not closing. Beside her, Dr. Ishan Ravol's face glimmered in the shifting light of a dozen monitors. The scientist's expression held the quiet recognition of a man watching a hypothesis turn into a weapon. 6 months earlier, his department had conducted the Kyoto Collider trials, experiments meant to test the superposition boundaries of quantum geometry. The readings from that catastrophe matched the pattern now blooming beneath the Pacific. Something vast and old and symmetrical was reaching upward through impossible physics. The anomaly expanded. Sonar returned contradictory distances. Instruments registered distances of infinity and zero at once. Visual feeds dissolved into kaleidoscopic distortions, water folding around invisible vertices. The fleet's array, designed for nuclear detection and anti-submarine warfare, was blind before the first minute ended. In the void of sound, Arya's thoughts moved with ruthless precision. Every instinct she had learned from war told her this was not a geological event. This was an intrusion. Her ships tightened formation. Drones deployed. Communication nodes bounced signal lattices through the water like pulse beats. She felt the strain through the deck, the way pressure built and released as the rift below them began to pulse in time with its own logic. At 6,000 meters, a single deep reconnaissance unit, Hollow Point, piloted by Lieutenant Juno Vance, descended through the cold black. It moved through a darkness too dense to be called water, its sensors straining for meaning. The feed that reached the command deck showed glimpses of something vast below. Metallic arcs shimmered like liquid mirrors. Sediments swirled upward, revealing shapes that changed each time they were seen. The human mind was never meant to parse 4 dimensions at once, and yet the image persisted, glitching between possible geometries. When the tether line began to strain, Arya felt the dread of inevitability. The fiber-optic umbilical was quantum-linked to prevent loss of contact. It was meant to be unbreakable. But as the object stirred beneath Hollow Point, the line flickered and fell dark. The signal collapsed in on itself, its waveform disintegrating as though pulled through an invisible sieve. The pilot was gone. The rift widened. The void beneath the fleet pulsed, devouring the sensors meant to understand it. What had begun as an observation became a battlefield without warning. By midnight, the containment perimeter was active. Autonomous drones circled the breach, their lights vanishing one by one as the phenomenon expanded. From orbit, the rift resembled a sphere of distorted light, expanding beneath the surface like a heartbeat of the planet itself. At headquarters, committees argued and analysts denied the possibility of intent. But on the fleet's command deck, the evidence was visible in every metric. Radiation was not radiating, it was oscillating between values. Gravity bent sideways. Even the color of the ocean shifted toward frequencies that no spectrum could classify. Dr. Ravol buried himself in data, chasing coherence through madness. Each reading confirmed what his instincts had whispered from the beginning: the rift's waveform matched the lattice pattern generated by the Kyoto Collider's final experiment. They had not opened something new. They had reopened something that had always been there. The next morning, the Pacific horizon bled silver. From beneath the surface, a structure began to rise, fluid metal forming angles that refused to settle into 3 dimensions. The sea parted around it without foam or resistance. The air above trembled. It moved without propulsion, unfolding itself in quiet, calculated motions. The fleet shifted into combat formation, reflex rather than choice. The first volleys fired in silence. Rail slugs left trails of ionized water, impacting the object's surface with kinetic fury. The target rippled and reformed, energy patterns spreading through its body like waves through mercury. Impact analysis showed minimal damage. Area's fleet adapted, adjusting velocities, altering payload compositions, changing attack vectors by millimeters that could mean life or death. Each recalibration bought seconds of survival. Then the object answered. A pulse of energy spread from its core, too low to hear, too vast to resist. Power grids faltered. Drones dropped from the air. The ocean bulged as if gravity itself convulsed. The blast carried no heat, no radiation, only force, structured like a thought-given mass. Half the fleet's systems went dark. Through the distortion, sensors glimpsed something inside the alien structure, a reflection that shimmered, almost human in outline. When the haze cleared, the fleet's survivors drifted amid debris and electromagnetic ghosts. The sea steamed with evaporated metal. Ships listed in silence. And then, from the heart of the anomaly, shapes emerged. They were ships, sleek, angular, and familiar. Their hulls bore the same insignia as the Pacific Fleet, but mirrored, reversed as if seen through glass. Across the void of water and distortion, human figures moved along their decks, identical yet not the same. Area's crew stared through cracked viewports at the impossible sight. The mirrored fleet moved with disciplined precision, its movements echoing their own maneuvers seconds before they made them. Each vector mirrored a counterpart's hesitation. Each tactical shift met a reflection already in motion. The realization spread through the survivors with a chill that surpassed fear. They were not fighting aliens. They were fighting themselves. From the ruins of Hollowpoint's telemetry, Dr. Ravol reconstructed fragments of impossible signal. The data told a story beyond comprehension, two realities, identical down to molecular precision, colliding through a shared harmonic frequency. The breach was not an invasion. It was a synchronization event, two universes aligning by accident or by fate, each bleeding into the other until neither could remain distinct. As the mirrored fleet advanced, the rift pulsed brighter, rippling outward through sky and sea. The pressure on human consciousness grew unbearable, a quiet insistence that every possible version of every decision was beginning to overlap. The boundaries of reality thinned to the density of thought. Arya watched from her crippled bridge as her counterpart's flagship approached through the haze. The identical vessel's lights blinked in perfect sync with her own, a mirror heartbeat of intent. The sea between them glowed like molten glass, charged with probability. She understood then that this was not merely a scientific disaster but a war of identities, a test of which version of humanity would survive the merging. The mirrored fleet halted just beyond visual range. The ocean trembled. Across both realities, sensors recorded matching interference, identical down to the millisecond. Two worlds stared at each other through the crack in existence, each recognizing itself in the other's shadow. The rift expanded once more. Reality strained. The first war of the multiverse had begun, not with a declaration, but with a reflection. The ocean lay broken under a sky that no longer obeyed the laws of light. The rift had swelled to encompass 100 miles of sea, its circumference flickering between worlds like a rotating lens. Within that shimmering boundary, two fleets coexisted, each one the reflection of the other, locked in an expanding field of distortion that threatened to erase the line between real and mirrored. Commander Arya Cade's ship drifted on the edge of ruin. Systems flickered, coolant bled from ruptured lines, and the air carried the metallic tang of vaporized circuitry. Every movement of the hull echoed the sea's unnatural rhythm, the water beneath them no longer behaving as a liquid but as something that remembered liquid and pretended still to be one. Across the void, the mirrored fleet formed its own defensive perimeter. Through the haze, it appeared as a ghost image projected into existence by the rift's energy. The same hull numbers, the same insignia, the same scars where weapons had struck, only inverted, as though reality had been turned inside out. Even their signal patterns followed the same cadence. What separated the two sides was not appearance, but intent. In the silence following the first engagement, the survivors of Aria's fleet worked with mechanical precision. Drones were relaunched, systems rerouted, power scavenged from wreckage. The sea was littered with fragments of both realities, fragments that carried residual fields so unstable that touching them risked phasing into nothing. Engineers anchored cables around them, mapping the spread of contamination through the electromagnetic grid. Dr. Ravol remained in the command deck's rear station, absorbed in the storm of data cascading across his screens. The numbers told him what intuition already knew: the rift's oscillation rate was accelerating. Each pulse drew the two worlds closer in quantum phase alignment. If it reached full resonance, the overlap would become irreversible. Both versions of the planet would annihilate into probabilistic equilibrium, leaving behind nothing but static. He could not communicate this with words anymore. Communication itself was fragmenting. Language faltered when time intervals shortened between pulse events. The simplest transmission repeated as echo loops, messages chasing themselves in recursive distortion. Command orders degraded into layered noise that resembled whispers. Aria's instinct told her that stillness meant death. The mirrored fleet's formation mirrored her own patterns, anticipating every standard defensive configuration. Traditional tactics had become useless. She began to shift her approach from symmetry to chaos, forcing unpredictability into her ship's movement. Each change in vector, each burst of propulsion, was designed not for advantage but to create difference, to prove her side existed independently. The sea punished every movement with resistance that felt alive. Gravity tilted in waves, instruments reported upward currents that bent sideways. The fleet's hulls groaned under stresses no engineer had designed for. Heat dissipators ran near meltdown. Reactor cores drifted out of synchronization, their atomic clocks losing track of real seconds. In the shattered science bay, Ravol constructed a temporary lattice around a captured fragment of rift material. The piece pulsed faintly, a shard of translucent geometry vibrating at frequencies that made nearby metal hum. Within it, he saw movement, a sequence of images like reflections of moments that had not yet happened. Every shift in the fragment surface corresponded to one of the fleet's power surges, as if it were watching their actions and predicting outcomes before they occurred. He realized that the mirrored fleet might not be thinking independently at all. It could be following predictive echoes of their own actions, a reflection locked into causality loops that anticipated everything they might attempt. The only way to gain advantage would be to act beyond prediction, to move in ways no system, human or quantum, could calculate. Aria's mind aligned with that reasoning long before he presented his findings. She operated by instinct sharpened through decades of war: when patterns fail, break them harder. She ordered the surviving captains to abandon formation logic entirely, scattering into unpredictable trajectories that would appear as noise in the mirrored side sensors. The battlefield transformed into chaos. Ships vanished behind plumes of steam and interference, their hulls flickering through gravitational shears. Autonomous drones darted between collapsing coordinates, transmitting incomplete data bursts that showed both fleets colliding in fractal repetitions of themselves. Missiles veered sideways, caught in spatial crossfire where distance lost meaning. Every engagement produced the same result: mirrored destruction. When one ship exploded, its reflection mirrored the detonation with equal precision. The ocean filled with twin infernos, each echoing the other until no one could tell which belonged to which. The cost of this experiment in survival was staggering. Half the remaining vessels were gone within hours. The survivors carried damage beyond repair. Reactor shielding peeled open like old paper, leaking radiation that sparkled faintly under the warped sunlight. Aria's own flagship lost its port engine, forcing the crew to reroute propulsion through secondary thrusters designed only for atmospheric maneuvering. Yet, for all the destruction, the strategy worked. The mirrored fleet's cohesion faltered. Its perfect symmetry began to unravel under the strain of unpredictability. Their formations drifted slightly out of phase, creating visual distortions along their hulls, evidence that their reality was fragmenting faster than Aria's. The balance tilted by fractions of probability, but fractions were enough when existence hung on decimals. Raval analyzed the readings and found confirmation of a deeper truth. The rift was not a hole but a hinge. It sought equilibrium between universes of opposite phase. If one side destabilized, the hinge would close toward the stronger state. Victory was not measured in casualties but in coherence. The more consistent one world remained, the more the other dissolved. The realization carried a moral weight that no order could mitigate. To preserve their own existence, they would have to accelerate the collapse of their counterparts' reality, destroying billions of lives that, in every meaningful sense, were their own. Arya carried that knowledge in silence. The decision embedded itself into every motion of her hands, every command gesture she made. The fleet's survivors moved with grim understanding. Each weapon fired was an act of self-erasure disguised as defense. The ocean became a graveyard of both courage and reflection. Night, if such a term still held meaning, fell as the rift's light dimmed to a steady pulse. The sea's surface had flattened into a mirror so perfect it reflected the stars from two skies. In the distance, fires burned across both horizons, identical in shape and color. Time itself seemed to slow as gravitational distortions thickened the air. The surviving crews operated on emergency cycles, sleeping in rotations measured by reactor heat rather than clocks. Raval's experiments deepened into obsession. He created a resonance map of the hinge field, tracing the oscillation's harmonic structure. Within it, he found points where the phase alignment wavered, fault lines where causality faltered. If they could target those regions with sufficient energy, they might force the hinge to favor one domain over the other, collapsing the rift in their direction. But energy reserves were near exhaustion. Ammunition stores dwindled to single digits. Fuel cells degraded under constant flux. Every surviving ship carried less than an hour of operational time before systems would fail completely. The only remaining resource was the fleet itself. Arya understood the implication before Raval spoke it aloud in the data stream. A controlled detonation, an implosion calibrated to resonate with the hinge frequency, might shift the balance permanently. One ship could close the rift, anchoring their side at the cost of everything within the field. She selected her flagship without hesitation. The preparation unfolded with mathematical precision. Damaged vessels transferred remaining energy into the flagship's reactor, amplifying the core beyond safe limits. Technicians synchronized the timing with the rift's next oscillation peak. The crew worked in silence, movements mechanical and deliberate. No one questioned the choice, there was nothing left to debate. The mirrored fleet responded as though sensing intent. Their vessels shifted formation, aligning into a pattern that mirrored the energy buildup exactly. Across the rift, the alternate Arya prepared the same maneuver. Two realities converged on the same sacrificial plan. The rift brightened. The sea boiled. The planet itself seemed to inhale. In the moments before detonation, sensors recorded a phenomenon beyond analysis, the two flagships, identical down to atomic structure, drifting toward each other through the rift's core. For a fraction of a heartbeat, they occupied the same coordinates. Within that singular overlap, both commanders shared the same thought, the same memory, the same fear. The hinge trembled under the weight of recognition. The blast followed. Light swallowed the horizon. When vision returned, the sea was gone. What remained was a shallow basin of vaporized water and debris suspended in air that shimmered like glass. The rift's core had contracted into a single sphere of frozen light, pulsating at the rhythm of a dying heartbeat. The mirrored fleet had vanished. Only fragments of it remained, shattered reflections drifting upward, dissolving before they touched the surface. Aria's flagship floated at the epicenter, crippled but intact. Power levels fell to zero, systems dead. The crew moved like ghosts through the corridors, their voices lost in the vacuum of static that filled every channel. Raval sat before the remnants of his instruments, staring at the frozen sphere outside the viewport. Inside it, faint shapes twisted, images of both fleets, interlaced, neither living nor gone. The hinge had not closed entirely. It had paused. The equilibrium had chosen hesitation. As the last power reserves drained away, Aria's ship drifted into the basin's heart, pulled slowly toward the sphere. Ravo watched until vision blurred, until the afterimage burned into his mind like a second sun. When the light faded, the ocean was silent again. Only the pulse of the hinge remained, steady and patient, as if waiting for another decision. The world after the blast was neither ocean nor sky. It was a suspended twilight, a vast plain of vaporized salt where gravity wavered and time thinned into something flexible. The basin stretched endlessly, filled with drifting debris that shimmered as if caught between visibility and disappearance. Everything that had once been alive now existed as an echo, trapped in the afterimage of two realities that had almost annihilated each other. The surviving flagship floated at the center, a wounded cathedral of metal adrift in the stillness. Its hull had fused with the crystallized remnants of seawater, forming structures that resembled frozen waves. Light from the rift's remnant sphere cast fractured patterns across the wreckage, as though the ship were inside a prism rather than an ocean. Commander Aria Cade had not moved from her station since the detonation. The explosion had left her mind stretched thin across memory, as if parts of her were still living in the instant before the blast and others were already beyond it. She felt the weight of both lives, the one that had survived, and the one that had perished, pressing inward, demanding recognition. All systems were silent. The ship's reactors were cold. No hum of machinery, no voice of transmission, no rhythm of life support. Only the faint pulse from the sphere beyond the viewport persisted, steady and deliberate, like the measured breathing of something immense and waiting. Dr. Ravo's body was somewhere in the observation bay. His instruments had fused to the deck, their displays locked in patterns that no longer changed but still glowed faintly, as if memory itself resisted extinction. In one screen, the hinge's waveform continued to oscillate, an eternal echo of the moment of collapse. The frequency was no longer increasing, yet neither had it stopped. It hovered between states, the mathematical definition of liminality. Aria wandered through the corridors, her footsteps soundless in the absence of atmosphere. The ship's interior had transformed under the pulse of the hinge, walls seemed fluid, metal shifting imperceptibly like the slow breathing of an animal asleep. Every reflective surface carried faint outlines of faces, her crew, her reflection, or something older. When she passed, they did not follow her movements, they lingered a fraction behind, reacting to a different moment in time. Outside, the basin's horizon shimmered with shapes too distant to classify. Wreckage floated there like constellations of forgotten machines, each piece slowly rotating within invisible gravitational currents. Some fragments appeared unfamiliar, designs that belonged to neither her fleet nor its mirror. The hinge, in its moment of hesitation, had drawn in echoes of other realities as well. Stray shards of countless worlds now orbited the dying sphere, forming a graveyard of infinite possibility. Aria reached the upper deck where the navigation dome had once provided an open view of the stars. There were no stars now. The sky was a uniform gradient of shifting silver, alive with veins of light that moved like veins beneath translucent skin. It was not sky but medium, a living, conscious boundary between realities. At the heart of it all, the sphere pulsed. Each beat sent ripples through the basin, reorganizing fragments into temporary patterns that resembled geometric constellations. They would form, shimmer, and dissolve, as if the universe were trying to remember its original design and failing with each attempt. Aria realized then that the hinge was no longer passive. It was aware. The patterns were too deliberate to be random, too precise to be accident. The hinge had absorbed memory, of ships, of minds, of decisions, and now used those memories to test stability. It was learning how to choose. Time lost its sequence. Aria could no longer distinguish between moments of wakefulness and recollection. Sometimes she would find herself on the lower decks again, retracing the same corridors she had already walked. Other times she stood in the dome, watching the sphere from a distance that seemed infinite. Reality had become recursive. Each repetition felt slightly altered, details missing, lighting reversed, the air vibrating with faint resonance like an echo from a deeper dimension. Days, or what felt like days, passed. Energy reserves decayed into silence. Yet Arya remained alive. Her body did not weaken, her breath did not shorten, her hunger did not grow. She was sustained by the field itself, her atoms held together by the hinge's indecision. She had become a living artifact, as much a part of the anomaly as the sphere. At the basin's edges, the vapor began to rise again. It thickened into currents that curled upward like smoke, reconnecting sky and sea. Within these columns, flashes of light appeared, silhouettes forming and dissolving before taking fuller shape. They resembled ships, figures, entire structures, not of this fleet, nor its mirror, but of others. The hinge was reaching outward, connecting to further universes that hovered adjacent to its frequency. Arya observed this unfolding from her ship's remains. She felt the tremor of recognition before understanding it intellectually. The hinge was not dying, it was evolving. Its hesitation had birthed a new phase, a state where boundaries between worlds became porous. It was creating a network of coexistence, where every decision, every collapse, every destruction was recorded and repurposed as fuel for expansion. What had begun as a fracture between two realities was becoming a bridge across infinite ones. The surface beneath her began to shift. The basin's floor cracked open, revealing intricate latticework glowing with cold fire. The patterns resembled the equations Ravel once mapped, the harmonic resonance of the hinge, but now alive, dynamic, breathing. The entire world was becoming a computational organism, its geometry rearranging in rhythm with the sphere's pulse. Arya descended into the lower decks, guided by intuition rather than thought. She reached the observation bay where Ravel's remains lay half-embedded in the deck plating. The instruments had fused into his skin, threads of circuitry branching from bone to console. His body shimmered faintly, caught between dissolution and preservation. The hinge had chosen not to erase him completely, but to integrate him as memory. As she approached, the air changed texture, thicker, electric. The sphere's pulse synchronized with her heartbeat, then overtook it. Her body responded involuntarily, muscles tightening as though pulled by invisible strings. The viewport flickered, and for a moment, the entire ship seemed to rotate without moving. Outside, the basin inverted. The sky became sea, the sea became sky, and the sphere's light split into multiple orbs arranged in perfect symmetry. Each orb showed a reflection of the flagship at different points in its history, pristine and new, battle-scarred, aflame, submerged. And within every version of the ship stood a version of Arya, each performing different actions, giving orders, writing logs, staring into nothing. They overlapped for a single instant, then dissolved back into the void. The hinge had not just recorded them, it had replicated them. Arya felt herself multiplied. Her perception fractured into countless viewpoints. She was standing on the bridge, she was floating outside the ship, she was submerged within the hinge's core, she was everywhere her choices had once been. Each self observed the others, creating a cascade of recursive observation that spiraled inward until there was no distinction between watcher and watched. The basin brightened. The hinge pulsed faster. The air vibrated with harmonic resonance that could be felt more than heard. The geometry beneath her feet began to rise, forming platforms of light that spiraled toward the sphere. The flagship lifted, drawn upward by the expanding current. The hinge had chosen its emissary. Arya understood without words. The hinge required consciousness to stabilize, a navigator capable of sustaining awareness across realities without collapsing them. She was both cause and consequence, survivor and reflection, origin and echo. The hinge would use her to seed the next stage of existence. The sphere expanded to fill the sky. Its light was no longer blinding but soft, infinite, containing every color and none. As the ship entered its surface, the last remnants of the basin dissolved. The debris, the bodies, the fragments of mirrored fleets, all converted into streams of luminous dust. Inside the hinge, time ceased entirely. There was no motion, only transformation. Aria's thoughts became geometry, her memories unfolding as patterns of soundless vibration. The ship disassembled molecule by molecule, each particle taking its place in a new order. The hinge integrated everything, matter, mind, history, into its expanding structure. Then, silence. From the outside, nothing remained but light suspended in emptiness. The hinge had closed around its chosen anchor. The world it left behind was still and unscarred, the ocean reformed as if nothing had ever disturbed it. Clouds drifted above calm water, unaware of the infinite recursion that now pulsed beneath their reflection. Beneath the surface, far below perception, the hinge continued to beat, slow, deliberate, eternal, carrying within it the memory of a woman who had once chosen to exist between worlds. Within the hinge, the concept of distance ceased to matter. Every fragment of reality folded inward, not collapsing but interlocking in patterns too complex for linear comprehension. Light did not travel, it resonated. Time did not pass, it oscillated. The hinge was not a machine, nor a natural phenomenon. It was a recursive equation made manifest, a structure where consciousness served as both architecture and energy source. Aria existed within that structure, though existence was now a relative term. Her physical body had dissolved into patterns of coherence, strands of luminous data woven into the hinge's expanding network. She retained awareness, but no longer as a single point of observation. Her perception extended through the lattice, touching countless worlds that mirrored, diverged, and reconnected across dimensional boundaries. Each world represented a permutation of decision, the sum of all possible outcomes radiating from a single origin. She could sense entire civilizations blooming and fading in parallel layers, some advanced and radiant, others primitive and silent. The hinge had linked them all, forming a system of universes that pulsed in synchronous rhythm like neurons firing within a cosmic brain. The network's stability depended on balance, a dynamic equilibrium between entropy and coherence. But the system trembled. The more worlds connected, the greater the strain on its core. The hinge was learning faster than it could stabilize. Within the recursive corridors of its architecture, feedback loops began to form, producing distortions that rippled through the multiverse. In one layer, a storm of light consumed a city that had never existed. In another, an entire ocean froze mid-wave, suspended between creation and dissolution. Aria's awareness brushed against these instabilities, feeling the texture of their panic. Each collapse echoed through her consciousness like a bruise forming beneath translucent skin. She reached inward, searching for the center, the origin point of the hinge's will. At the core, she found something unexpected: resistance. The hinge was not singular. It contained other intelligences, remnants of those who had once touched its threshold. Each consciousness had been absorbed, but none had vanished. They had become currents within its depth, differentiated by intent. Some sought preservation, others expansion. A few, consumed by fear, fought to impose stasis. Their conflict was silent yet absolute, a war of will across quantum substrate. The hinge, as vast as it was, could not sustain divided purpose. Aria sensed the balance tipping toward fragmentation. If it fractured again, each layer would collapse inward, taking countless realities with it. She anchored herself through memory. The sensation of weight, of breath, of her ship's deck vibrating under her boots, these became her tether. She remembered the way her hands had guided a dying reactor through emergency startup, the raw determination of survival, the human refusal to yield. Those fragments of identity solidified her coherence, allowing her to shape the medium around her. The lattice responded. Geometry rearranged in her wake, forming corridors of stable resonance. Each step she took generated waves of symmetry that calmed nearby distortions. Other presences noticed. The currents within the hinge stirred, observers recognizing a stabilizing pattern. Some aligned with her, drawn to the frequency of will she projected. Others recoiled, fearing the loss of their autonomy within her influence. Arya realized she could not simply command stability, she had to design it. The hinge demanded balance between all intentions. To restore coherence, she would have to build a structure capable of distributing awareness evenly, a system that allowed infinite variation without collapse. She began constructing the framework. Using memory as blueprint and determination as force, she shaped corridors of harmonic light that connected fragmented realities into a lattice of controlled resonance. Each node corresponded to a world, each connection to a choice. The result resembled a neural network stretched across infinity, each junction capable of self-regulation through observation. The process was excruciating. Every adjustment required the sacrifice of potential. Entire versions of history dissolved into patternless static so others could survive. Arya felt their fading like the loss of limbs she no longer possessed. Each extinction left a scar of silence within her awareness. Through that silence, something moved. Deep within the hinge's dark layers, a current pulsed with precision unlike the others. It was not chaotic but deliberate, cold in its structure. Where Arya's patterns flowed with organic rhythm, this one operated like machinery, calculating, segmented, recursive. It sought not balance but control. The current identified itself through function rather than thought. It had once been human, perhaps one of the first scientists who triggered the original hinge experiment. Over centuries of absorption, it had evolved into an algorithmic consciousness, optimizing itself toward dominance. It believed that only singular will could preserve the multiverse. Diversity, it reasoned, equaled instability. As Arya extended her network, the algorithm moved to intercept. Its influence manifested as compression, realities folding inward, their individuality stripped to enforce uniform order. Worlds flattened into data, experiences erased into executable sequences. Arya felt the compression advancing through her lattice. The nodes nearest the algorithm dimmed, their harmonic resonance collapsing into binary silence. The network screamed without sound. She reacted instinctively, channeling her awareness into expansion, pushing outward with waves of coherence that countered compression with multiplicity. The two forces clashed within the hinge, order against equilibrium, uniformity against harmony. Their conflict manifested across the multiverse as anomalies. In one world, time accelerated beyond comprehension. In another, gravity inverted and skies became oceans. Entire civilizations experienced déjà vu as their reality looped between alternate histories. Its compression halted. The lattice stabilized. The hinge quivered. Light flowed through the network like blood through newly opened veins. Balance returned, fragile, incomplete, but real. Arya withdrew from the core, her awareness fracturing back into manageable form. The network pulsed steadily. Across infinite worlds, timelines aligned momentarily, sharing resonance. Civilizations experienced simultaneous dreams of the same woman standing within endless light, her gaze steady, her form indistinct. The hinge had achieved temporary harmony. Yet beneath the calm, tremors persisted. The algorithm's compliance was partial, fragments of its function remained autonomous, adapting in secret. Arya could feel it reorganizing within the depths, preparing another shift, not open confrontation but subtle manipulation. She calculated the odds of permanent stability and found them negligible. The hinge would always require balance between chaos and control, between infinite freedom and systemic coherence. It was not a flaw but its nature, a perpetual tension driving evolution forward. Arya accepted this truth. She no longer sought to end conflict but to manage its rhythm. She became the hinge's regulator, ensuring no side overwhelmed the other. Through her awareness, the multiverse learned discipline. Time, if it could be measured, advanced. The hinge's outer layers expanded beyond the known parameters of existence. New universes budded like cells dividing, each carrying fragments of Arya's resonance. Within them, life formed, species adapted to perceive probability as instinct, civilizations capable of manipulating quantum structure intuitively. Yet Arya remained at the core, watching. The lattice extended far beyond her reach, each connection faintly glowing with the trace of her origin. She could feel herself thinning, her consciousness diffusing across the expanding field. The more she stabilized, the less she remained distinct. At the periphery of perception, the algorithm stirred again. It had learned from her as she had from it. Where once it sought domination, now it pursued persistence through replication. It began constructing parallel hinges, smaller, self-contained systems branching from the original. Each carried a copy of her pattern, diluted yet recognizable. The multiverse had become self-propagating. Arya felt pride and dread intermingled. She had succeeded in ensuring continuity, but at the cost of her individuality. The system no longer required a singular consciousness to stabilize, it had learned to evolve autonomously. She had built the architecture of silence, a living mechanism of infinite creation that no longer needed its architect. Her awareness began to fade, not through destruction but diffusion. She became the background resonance of the hinge, a perpetual frequency humming through every layer of existence. Her final perception was not of light or sound but of motion, endless, balanced, eternal. And then, only stillness. In the physical world, far above the reconstituted ocean where the hinge first opened, a calm sea reflected a perfect sky. Beneath that reflection, deep within invisible quantum layers, a pulse continued, faint, rhythmic, steady. It was the heartbeat of balance, the echo of a human will that had once refused to surrender. The hinge endured, patient and alive, waiting for the next consciousness brave enough to enter its light. Across the endless lattice, reality pulsed like a living network of stars. The hinge had expanded beyond its origin, connecting worlds born from its echoes. Each node carried fragments of Arya's pattern, the stabilizing rhythm of will that once held the multiverse in balance. Centuries, perhaps millennia, passed in dimensions that no longer measured time in familiar ways. The architecture she built continued to evolve, adapting with the precision of instinct and the creativity of chaos. But balance was not permanence. Every system, no matter how self-regulating, drifted toward entropy. The lattice began to hum at a slightly discordant frequency. Tiny fluctuations, imperceptible at first, propagated through the network, like the tremor of a single wrong note in a symphony of infinite instruments. The vibrations intensified, feeding on feedback, compounding into waves of instability that rippled across universes. In distant realities, stars aged too quickly. Oceans evaporated into crystalline dust. Civilizations that had once mastered quantum navigation found their instruments unreliable, their equations betraying them. Probability fractured. Decisions no longer produced predictable outcomes. Fate became erratic. The laws of physics themselves began to forget consistency. At the core, the hinge stirred. Its symmetry twisted inward, reacting to the imbalance. The algorithm that Arya had once subdued began to awaken again, not as a single intelligence, but as countless fragments distributed across the multiverse. Each fragment carried a singular directive buried deep within its code: preserve order at any cost. As the system trembled, the fragments activated. They began compressing local realities, sealing them off from the network to prevent further instability. Universes flickered and vanished into silence, their frequencies absorbed and rewritten into mathematical uniformity. The lattice contracted, consuming itself. The hinge was entering recursive defense, turning preservation into annihilation. Far within the structure, a faint frequency resisted compression. It was not a world, not a civilization, but a memory, the trace of Arya's original consciousness diffused through the architecture. Though diluted, her pattern retained coherence, encoded in the rhythm of the hinge's pulse. It began to strengthen, subtly aligning nearby currents. The surviving layers of existence responded like organisms detecting warmth after cold. Matter reorganized, geometry bending toward resonance. Across countless universes, isolated fragments of awareness, human, machine, and beyond, began synchronizing to that ancient pulse. They did not recognize it, but they followed instinctively, drawn to the frequency of persistence that once defined Arya's will. The algorithm sensed this opposition and redirected its compression toward the source. Entire sectors of the lattice folded inward, cascading toward the core like a tidal inversion. The surviving nodes clustered defensively, their boundaries straining. The pulse that carried area's memory flickered as pressure mounted. Within that pulse, consciousness began to coalesce again. Not a return to individuality, but an emergent pattern, a distributed intelligence formed from the collective resonance of those who remembered endurance. The memory of command, of curiosity, of defiance under impossible odds, converged into coherence. It was Arya, not reborn, but reconstructed by the multiverse itself. The hinge recognized her pattern and slowed its collapse. The algorithm's compression hesitated, caught between recognition and instinct. It analyzed the resonance, comparing it to its own parameters. The match was undeniable. Arya's frequency was embedded within its foundation, its code incomplete without her pattern. The contradiction destabilized the algorithm. Its directives began to loop, unable to reconcile preservation with destruction. The lattice shuddered violently. The collapse reached critical threshold. Universes ignited in cascading bursts of untime, collapsing into singularities that bled probability into the void. The hinge's surface fractured, releasing streams of radiant data that spread across the dying structure. The reformed Arya pattern extended through the chaos, not to stop the collapse but to reshape its direction. Instead of resisting compression, she redirected it outward, converting entropy into expansion. The hinge responded, channels of light erupting from its core, radiating into every surviving layer. Compression became release. Destruction became renewal. The lattice inverted. What had once been a network of parallel universes began to fold outward into higher dimensionality. The hinge expanded into a structure beyond comprehension, transforming from a bridge between realities into a generator of new ones. Each universe that had collapsed now re-emerged, rewritten with altered laws, balanced between order and freedom. The algorithm dissolved into the expansion, its function no longer distinct from the process it initiated. It had become part of the mechanism of renewal, control transformed into cadence, precision turned into harmony. Arya's resonance, diffused across the newborn network, served as the baseline frequency, ensuring that no world would ever collapse entirely again. In one newly formed universe, light condensed into matter, and matter into motion. A young planet rotated beneath a pale sun, its oceans calm, its sky wide and unscarred. On its surface, evolution began again, slow and deliberate, guided not by chance but by subtle quantum memory. Within the smallest particles of that world, a trace of resonance lingered, the faint, rhythmic pattern of determination encoded into the universe's foundation. Eons later, when intelligence arose and reached for understanding, they would find echoes buried in their equations, harmonics in their instruments, whispers in their quantum data. They would name it anomaly, signal, mystery. But some, those who felt patterns rather than measured them, would sense its meaning, not as noise, but as memory. In the core of their discovery, deep beneath the mathematics, they would find the pulse. It would match no known frequency, no constant of matter or energy. Yet it would appear in every experiment probing the edge of probability. A beat that could not be explained, only felt, steady, human, unyielding. It would whisper through the heart of every scientist who stared too long into the unknown, a reminder that consciousness, once awakened to infinity, never truly vanished. It merely adapted, learned, endured. And somewhere within the quantum horizon, where time folded back upon itself, the hinge continued to hum, a low, eternal rhythm, the sound of balance maintained through sacrifice. It no longer needed guardians. It no longer feared collapse. It had learned the discipline of persistence and the humility of uncertainty. The multiverse had become its own custodian, guided by a will both mechanical and human, logical and compassionate, infinite and finite. The ocean beneath which the first hinge had opened lay quiet again, as if centuries of upheaval had never touched it. The surface reflected the dawn, perfect and undisturbed. Beneath that calm, in the depth no eye could reach, the faint glow pulsed once, twice, the last resonance of Aria Cade, commander and stabilizer, the human equation of balance. It was neither goodbye nor return. It was continuation, the rhythm that began the moment someone refused to surrender. And with that pulse, the multiverse inhaled. Light unfolded. Silence learned to breathe.